I recently got this collection of 4 racing games for the ZX Spectrum, and I like the ZX Spectrum and I like racing games, so I figured I couldn't go too wrong. Opening this thing up, you get 4 games. You get Chase HQ, you get Hard Drivin', you get Turbo Outrun, and Power Drift, which I recently reviewed for the Commodore 64, and a poster, and a manual, of course. And one thing that's interesting about this collection is it has games from 4 different publishers, and that usually doesn't really happen. Usually it's a collection of 1 publisher. But I really bought this game for Chase HQ because it's kind of a remarkable port, and it's of course the one we're reviewing right now. The manual is not bad, though it is black and white, and has screenshots from some of the more advanced ports, or are those the arcade screenshots? I do really like the artwork on the back. It has a solid feel. It feels like they invested some real energy into the collection. It doesn't really feel like they just kind of dumped them out and Xeroxed the manual or something. And again, in the back you get screenshots from a much more powerful system. But let's pop this in and see what we get on the ZX. It tells you to stop the tape because it does have load times between levels if you are running it on 48K, which I am. There's also a 128K version, and I think it auto-detects, and in that case it'll load the whole game into memory and you get a few more sound effects and stuff like that. You don't get music in game either way, which is a little bit of a letdown for 128K owners, but again, we're going to be checking out the 48K version. But what I think is really remarkable about this port is they managed to squeeze in all the elements from the arcade game into this little cheap home computer that only has 48K of memory. This must have been a pretty expensive arcade machine at the time. One thing you might notice right now is that the dialogue that appears in speech samples in the arcade version and some of the other ports over here appear in a little ticker above your play area. And right off the bat, we see that it has a fairly remarkable 3D road engine. So, most 8-bit ports of racing games, they didn't really have hills, and if they did, they were pretty simple. This has all the geometry from the arcade game. It has, let's say, a branching road over here with no flicker or anything like that. And for what it's doing, the frame rate is actually pretty decent. The CPU of the ZX Spectrum, it's basically a Game Boy. And it has no help from the hardware for drawing the backgrounds or the sprites or anything like that. This is all pure CPU horsepower pulling this thing. So from a purely technical perspective, it's a remarkable game. I was very impressed by this. And in fact, back, maybe 15 years ago now, I was on IRC and talking to another retro game collector. And, I'm this American kid, and I think he was over in Brazil or somewhere. And I was talking about the Commodore 64, and he says, the Commodore 64, that's for, those spoiled rich kids. And I was like, what? I mean, in the United States, that was the cheapest home computer you could buy, was the Commodore 64. But that was the deluxe model. And anyway, long story short, he was saying, yeah, but, can the Commodore do this? And the truth is that the Commodore kind of can't. The Chase HQ port on the Commodore 64 was much, much worse than this. And this is quite good. So yeah, if you don't know Chase HQ, the basic premise of the game is that what you do is you're supposed to race down the road, kind of like Outrun, but the twist is that you're police, and you catch up with this criminal, and you have to ram their car until it bursts into flames, and then you pull them over. So it's, kind of like, I guess, being part of the LAPD or something. Have you ever noticed that about Los Angeles? Always police chases. I don't know what the deal is with that police department. And so yeah, you eventually pull this guy over and you read them the riot act. And, in the arcade one, you get these full screen pictures, but in this version, you just get these little talking heads, and that's fine. That's kind of cool. It's a good compromise. You might notice that the dialogue is fairly awkward. Let's go, Mr. Driver, and push it more. The dialogue was exactly the same in the arcade one. It's kind of part of the charm, I guess, of Chase HQ, right? So yeah, this is a pretty faithful port, but one thing we haven't really talked about is the gameplay. So, Chase HQ is a racing game kind of in the mold of something like Outrun, but, I find the car in Outrun quite a bit more responsive. They set up this Miami Vice kind of scenario where you're supposed to be kind of cutting off and zipping around different cars, but I never felt like the car was maneuverable enough to really pull that off, and that's true of the arcade version as well. The hitbox in this version is also a little bit big. There's definitely times when I think I'm safe, but I end up rear-ending a car. Now, the collisions aren't as severe as in other racing games, and that's a good thing. But I do feel like the game could have done a better job really making you feel like you're in a high-performance sports car. I mean, I think this is supposed to be a Porsche, right? But, it feels more like a Civic in this game. And like many other racing games from this era, every level is more or less the same thing. Get to the end before the time runs out, essentially. But there are some aspects of the game that are done really correctly, too. One thing that did impress me a bit is that, if you get to the bad guy you're supposed to stop, you get more time. So, you get 60 seconds when you sight the target vehicle. Okay, so by that point, the turbos might be pretty much used up, and those are very useful for clobbering the car. You can get many more hits in if you're turboing into them than if you're just, driving along, flowing it normally. If you continue, if you run out of time bashing the enemy car and you continue, you get 3 turbos, but you only get 40 seconds of time because, they factor in that you now have maximum turbos. And the reason turbos might be used up before, of course, is that you sometimes need them to get to the target vehicle in the allotted amount of time. So there are things about this game that are very well thought through. So if you can get past the minor nitpicks, I think you'll find a really good, intense, old-school racing game. It's not quite on the level with a game like, say, Outrun, that's at like an absolute classic status, but, it's fondly remembered. You might remember playing this in the arcades. If you have some nostalgia for it, or you're just looking for another game kind of in this mold, give this one a shot. You might really dig it. It's definitely a good port. If you like the arcade one, you'll like this one. So, if you've got a ZX Spectrum, go check it out.